Kia ora tātai. Tūtahi mihi tēnei kia koutou ko tai mai nei I tēnei ahihai. Ki tēnei o ngā wāhanga o te rā o kingitanga, tēnā koutou. Tautoko ngā mihi ai te atanei, mai te kaumātua te whare wānanga nei. Tēnā koe, matua. Me ngā rangatira o te whare wānanga kia koutou ko tai mai. Tautoko ngā mihi ki te kingitanga, kia kingitu heitia, me te whānau. Ka hui ka ariki, tēnā koutou. Ko Leonie Pihama tōku ingoa, no Te Atiawa, ngā mahanga taire, Ngāti Mahanga, mihi e tū whakaiti ana ki te mihi atu kia koutou I tēnei wā. Ko te kai whakahaere mō te matapunanga o te kotahi, nā te kotahi tēnei wāhanga e whakahaere ana. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Mihi ki ngā kai kōrero ko tai mai nei I rongi te karanga o te kaupapa, tēnā koutou. So just on behalf of Te Kotahi Research Institute, I'd like to welcome you to this session this afternoon, which really is a session that came from Aroha Te Kanoa, the idea of having a session that was around reflecting on 20 years of settlement today at Kingitanga Day. We've been very privileged to have Sarah Jane Tiakiwai come to facilitate the session on our behalf and to have a conversation with members of Waikato Tainui who were a part of the day in 1995 and a part of the build-up toward the settlement. For those of you who are not aware of Te Kotahi Research Institute, or Te Matapunanga o Te Kotahi, we are the institute that provides for the 19 iwi who are a part of Te Rōpū Manukura. Te Rōpū Manukura is a council of iwi, or a committee of iwi who sit alongside the Pro-Vice Chancellor Māori, Professor Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, and provide advice into the council. So the chair of Te Rōpū Manukura is actually on council, on the new council. The name Te Kotahi Research Institute is a name that honours Te Kotahi Bob Mahuta and the work done and the connection between him here at the university and the iwi, and particularly to Hopu Hopu, the research, the Waikato Tainui Research and Development College. So a lot of what we do, we try to do in collaboration with Sarah Jane and her team, and to do in ways that are going to be useful and transformative, both for Waikato Tainui and the iwi of the Sorohi, but also for the wider iwi on Te Rōpū Manukura. So we're really honoured to have Sarah Jane to facilitate the session this afternoon, a conversation and reflection on 20 years of settlement. And matua tame, John and Shane, tēnā koutou, we appreciate you having come here to share your reflections and your whakaaro in terms of both the 20 years past and prior to that, in terms of the history of Waikato Tainui, but also any thoughts you have on where to from here. So I'm going to hand it over to Sarah Jane, and she will continue the session forward. Tēnā koutou.
Tēnā tātou. Nei rau te mihi atu kia tātou katoe hui mai nei tēnei ahiahi. Kia koe Leonie, nau tō tātou hui whakatūwhira I tēnei rā. Huri no kia tātou tēnā tātou. As you can see from your program, things are slightly changed up a little bit, and rather than 3 for the price of 3, you're getting 4 for the price of 3. Due to not prior commitments, but more pressing commitments, unfortunately, both Koro and Nanaia are unable to be with us this afternoon. And I think, but you still have me, unfortunately, or fortunately. But I think in terms of how we're structuring the session, I think actually we'll be able to take you both in terms of the historical and contextualising the Raupatu itself, as well as being able to provide some real reflections as part of the intimate conversation around Raupatu in 20 years. We are really privileged to be able to have the panel that we do have in spite of Koro and Nanaia's unavailability. And all 3 of these fine gentlemen sitting up here have had quite extensive experience, both as a part of the tribal organisation, as part of the wider tribal community, extending well before the 20 years of the signing of Raupatu, but certainly after that as well. So the way that we're just going to run this program is that we have a short video, which is a clip commemorating the 20 years since the signing of the Raupatu on the 22nd of May 1995. And then really all my job is just to try and keep these men in line. It was described to me that this would be an intimate conversation and reflection. Really all I'm going to do is just hopefully that, it's not too intimate that they forget that there's the rest of us here that are quite keen to hear from their reflections and also their experiences. Tame Pokaia, John Te Maru, Shane Solomon have had extensive roles, but particularly in and around the signing of the Raupatu in 1995. Shane Solomon was the legal advisor to the Tainui Māori Trust Board. John Te Maru was the secretary for the Tainui Māori Trust Board. Tame Pokaia, as part of the Kahui Ariki, intimately connected with Tūranga Waewae Marae. All have had extensive, were during 1995, the years leading up to that, and since then have continued to have extensive involvement in our tribe's development. So I think, in spite of the fact that we have a slightly rearranged program, certainly our principal negotiator at the time, Te Kotahi Sir Robert Mahuta, after who the Te Kotahi Research Institute is named, he was the founder of our college, the Waikato Tainui College for Research and Development. Basically, this was something that he would say, well, you just switch it up, you roll with it, and so this is what we're doing this afternoon. So it's great to have you with us. And without further ado, I'll ask for our video to be rolled, and then I'll hand it over to our panel. Kia ora tātou.
Pai kia noho, tēnā koutou. Tiotahi ka nui te mihi atu kia koe e taki, e pupuru te Māori, mo te kingi, te whare wānanga nei, me mihi atu hoki ki te chairman o te kauni hera o te whare wānanga o Waikato, te tumuaki o te kura, me ngā kaihoi o te kura o te whare wānanga ka nui te mihi atu kia koutou. Koutou e pai nei i tēnei rangi, te whakarongo ki ngā koro, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Good afternoon. It's lovely to be here just to share a little bit of insight about our memories and what we can reflect on with the kaupapa to celebrate and on a Kingitanga Day, which I'm proud to say I'm grateful that the Whare Wānanga run such a kaupapa like this, and hopefully we can influence the peers, the taniwha across the other side of the Waikato River at Wintec to do something similar. Right, before we probably get down to the 20 years of Raupatu, I'll just give a little snapshot leading into it, and then we'll get down into settlement time. I'll just give a quick timeline history. And to understand Raupatu, you've got to have Raupatu for a reason, and the reason looks something like this. The first sort of attempt to get some sort of partnership in a legislative form between the Crown and Māori people was the whakaputanga, signed up in the northern tribes, and of course Waikato's Potatau being a signatory to the whakaputanga, or the Declaration of Independence, 35 to 39. It's got some strengths, it's got some weaknesses of the Declaration, and one of the strengths is almost 95% of the signatories are Northern Chiefs, and you've got a problem straight away with that. Number two, you had the ink is barely dry on the paper, and you have the second document in town, and that is the Treaty of Waitaki in the 1840s. A little bit better, it includes more chiefs into the document. The only problem you have with the messengers that are taking it around New Zealand may have a different message. You're not in the same domain. You're not sitting in the same room like this getting the same message. So you're going to have a bit of problems with that as well. And of course, Potatau is not a signatory to the treaty. So you'll probably see a lot, and Shane might reflect on some of the points that will raise as the government try to say to Waikato in the settlement, you're part of the treaty, etc. Now, as soon as the ink is dried on the paper for the treaty, the Crown moved pretty fast into doing things, and that was to get a lot of our land, a lot of our resources, and doing whatever it could rather than working in a partnership way. So if I can reflect that in terms of our natural state, it is like a bird. a bird has two wings that makes it fly. And if you load up one wing, that bird is going to tilt and come down into ground. So with the Māori and the crown on both of those wings, the crown loaded up his wing, hence the bird is coming down into crash mode. Now, and when the tribe saw that and didn't like what was happening, what the crown was doing, they decided to do something about it. And on the shores of the Pukawa in 1856, almost 1,800 chiefs got together, called by Te Heuheu Iwiko, and from that the unanimous decision was to put Pōtatau as the first Māori king. There's problems with that because Pōtatau did not want to become king, and many times he turned it down, and he had probably other thoughts, and one of those thoughts was he lived under the old tikanga method of the tribes back in those days, and where you had mana, you had rangatiratanga, and you also had this thing called utu if things didn't go to plan. And he had a little bit of that on his mind, especially with the killing of his grand-aunt Rangianewa. But by whanaunga, may I say, within Waikato, and I guess he wanted to seek redress for that killing. Hence one of his things that I do not want to become king. But I'm giving a snapshot of it, so I've got to cut it down because these guys are going to talk. So I'll fast track history for you. So in his decline to become king, all the chiefs pursued him, and in the end he finally gave up on the condition that he sees this high priest over in Te Ako to lift that sacredness or that tapu on his heart, so that he is free to carry this institution called the kingitanga. So his high priest lifted that tapu off him, and he was free, even though there's many statements that he did use, ko tō tara ki runga i aho, the sun is about to set on me, and they just countered him by saying, sir, the sun sets in the afternoon, but it rises in the morning, meaning that you can't wriggle out of being the king. And one of the statements that he did say upon being the king is, it is said, and I've heard it by Kaumātua, he talks about the kōhua of the piper. Kōhua of the piper, and you know the old way, smoking tobacco is a little bit different to today, where the Nana and Papa had the pipe. E te iwi, kei a koe te kōhua o te piper, e a hau te kakau. Tribes of New Zealand, you have the bowl of the pipe and I'll have the stick. Ki te peka mai koutou ki waho i te kōhua, ko te ngau tērā ōku niho ki au anō. If you jump out of the kōhua, kei te ngau tērā ōku niho. A pipe is no good without tobacco. Ka pai? A pipe is no good without tobacco in it. So a king is no good without people. So what he's saying there, you are here today at Pukawa. This is a good day at the office. But on a bad day, will you be there when I need you? On a bad day. Right? A good day, you are celebrating, yay, yay. Let's vote this man to become king. But what he's saying is in a metaphoric term. Ko te kōhua o te paipa, waiho ki a koutou, waiho ko te kakau i roto i tōku waha, ki te peka mai ki waho ko te ngau tērā ōku niho ki au anō. If you jump out, my teeth will gnash. You remember when you get to the end of the pipe, there's just one speck of tobacco in and you gnash. See Nana smoking pipe? That's what that means. That means she's running out of tobacco. But if you put that into a human terms and the people are gone, you'll be gnashing all right. And there's going to be some gnashing coming along in Waikato. And that gnashing or the biting of the teeth came in 1863 when Pōtatau was raised up as king. That's a sign that the Crown, led of course by Governor Gray, did not want any other one in this domain. So he made the challenge, and that's those famous words recorded by Dr. Pei Te Huranui Jones. Tukuna tō kingitanga ki raro, put down your kingship. And his response, e hake nāku, it doesn't belong to me. No, ngā rangatira o te muti, it belongs to the chiefs of this land. If you want me to take it off, go and ask the chiefs of this land to take it off me, because they put it on me at Pukawa. And Governor Gray basically said, if you don't take it off, he kau tāku, ka hara mai taku kau, ka inu mea te wai, kia pau katoa, I have a cow I have a cow, and it has many progeny, and when it comes, it'll drink the water until all the water is gone. And his response was, e wai hoa pua pua, e wai hoa pua pua ka mimiti. E mano āwhenua e kore e mimiti. If it's spring, where you collect your water grain, that will run dry because the sun shines on it and dries it. But because I understand this landmark called Aotearoa, where I get my resources and my water is deep in the bosom of Papatuanuku, it'll never run dry. I know this land better than you do, all right? So he waiho puapua ka mimiti he mano a whenua e kore e mimiti. He knows his landmarks. He will not perish. And then Governor Gray said, ki te pau katoa ngō kai, if your kai runs out, if I take your kai, what are you going to eat? I just go back to the food of my forebears in Tāne Mahuta, te para, te pohue, te mamaku, foods that our forebears ate when they got to this land. I know how to live in this land without the foods that you have. I've been doing that for hundreds of years. And when that food is gone, what are you going to do? What food are you going to give? And if you take all that food off me, I'm going to eat you. So that is the challenge in the context of the Crown to Chief Māori. The Crown never challenged any other chief but this man. And he asked the question, why did he challenge this man? And that's a big question you can talk about in the Whare. He was challenged, and that cow came up the Waikato River in 1863 in the British gunboats and attacked and killed men, women, and children, stretching from Rangiriri, Orako, Rangiaowhia, Pokehinahina, and Taranga, and other places. That cow had arrived to do damage to us. Following that was the confiscation and creation of legislation by the Crown of laws passed to take and to claim our resources, called the land. Whether it's mountains, waterways, places of worship, places of burying our dead, places of doing prayer, doing wana, all taken. Waikato, the tribes and people of Waikato were left to head south into the King Country and stay among our kin of Ngāti Maripoto and others. Hence the composition of one of those waiata, e pāto hau e weri raro, he ho mai aroha. And in the kupu, kei whea aku hoa I muara, where are my friends of former days? Karau ngai te au I. They have all gone, and I am left here to lament. I am left here to lament, not at those who have gone today of breast cancer or whatever, those who have gone because they fell in the trenches against the Crown and their invading forces. So from that time, it's the seeking of redress with Tāwhio, the second Potato's son, going across to England to try and seek redress. And when he returned to New Zealand, I haere Māori atu, I hoki Māori mai. When the kaumatu asked her, how did you get on? I went as a Māori, I came back as a Māori. In short terms, I did not get resolution. I probably came back with just a music box and a few other nice goodies from England. King Tarata, he tried to seek redress in Parliament in Wellington, but he finally realised when he was in Parliament in Wellington, there's someone senior than me, and I'm placed down in the legislative section, not having mana. So he returned to Waikato. King Tarata, he went to England to seek redress, and the same, just nothing happening. Until Princess Te Puia with her team of negotiators back in the 1940s sought redress and I guess gave, and Shane might elaborate further on it, gave settlement in that first settlement. Now you may say that is full and final in the 1846 settlement between the Crown or the government at that time and which set up the Tainui Māori Trust Board. So that is the first settlement. Now, when you say that's full and final, that's another question. Right, the second one, of course, in 1995, and then you've just seen the clip here with that, and they could possibly turn that as full and final as well, number 2. So if I just put it quickly into context, it is like, and I'll do it this way too, so we're not talking about how many acres, how big, how wide, etc. If someone took your bike, your son's bike, not mine, your son or your daughter's bike, and the police rug you up to come down to the station to pick it up, and that policeman said to you, yes, we've got your son's bike, but I represent the government, I represent the Crown, I've got a lot of power. Son, and the boy goes to get his bike, and he said, sir, could I have my bike back? And the policeman said, son, I've decided to give you the bell back of your bike. And the boy gets the bell, and he said, no, that's my bike. I want my bike back. And he said, I've got power. If you be mischievous here, I'll lock you up. So the boy walks out of jail, and he looks back at that police station. Now the question to you is that full and final? So I just want to leave that for you. Is that full and final when we talk about the bike? I have a view on that, you'll have a view on that. In terms of settlement, the Crown and the legal team always use that terminology on it, full and final, and as you know, our settlement in 1995 was probably 1 to 2%, $170 million in land package out of $12 billion, right? So that's full and final. And we know it's not full and final because Labour came to River, and of course the King's statement this year at the coronation, we've got our sights on Te Remu o Te Kahu, that is Auckland, where Pōtatau was based at Pukekohe by the Auckland Museum there. So we're looking at that as well, right? Full and final. That's just a snapshot of the timeline, and I'll come in somewhere with these guys. Ka pai.
Kia ora tātou. I'll stand up. Mihi ana kia koe Leone, mo tō mihi whakatau kia mātou, koutou katoa. Nō reira, he tautoko, te timatanga kōrero o tēnei rā, o te kaupapa o tēnei rā. Kia ora to you all. Shane and I are going to do a sort of a tag team type presentation. But first we wanted to give some context to the Raupatu Settlement 1995. So if I can get this to work. Okay. So we'll give some context and also some reflections on that journey, and then we'll open it up to a more open floor discussion about where to from here. Wrong way. Okay, try it again. No, not that one. Right. In 1995, Sir Robert Mahuta was asked, what is this claim and settlement about? And so we lifted a quote from the 1995 Tainui Māori Trust Board annual report. And this is what he said. Our people went to war over land, and if it takes another 100 years or more, we'll have to get that 1 million acres back. That's our first priority. Area that was encompassed in the principle, one of the principles of the Raupatu claim. And that principle was based on one of Tawhiao's sayings, I te ru whenua atu, me hoki whenua mai. As land was taken, so land should be returned. That became known as the land for land principle. But by 1995, it only applied to those lands which the Crown still had within its land holdings. So it only applied to the 90,000 acres that the Crown held at that time within the original Raupatu boundary. Several years before 1995, starting in 1993, the tribe asked for a sign of good faith from the Crown. A review had been done of surplus Crown properties within, well, actually it was within the whole country, but within Waikato. And there were two ex-military establishments and bases that were no longer required and that were surplus to Crown requirements. The first of these was at Hopopu, the army camp, and the second was the Air Force Base at Te Rapa. Now, with Hopopu, the Crown had confiscated that from the church, but the church received the lands there from the tribe as a gift and for education purposes. So, in a sense, we sort of saw Hopopu as being taken twice. And then later on, Hopopu became, of course, an army base which was used during World War I and World War II. So that was, from the tribal point of view and from the tribal perspective, it was seen as gifted land anyway, so whenua tuku. The Air Force Base at Te Rapa, however, was the first of the Raupatu properties to be returned to the tribe. So that was whenua Raupatu. Part of the land for land principle was also the notion of a gift back from the tribe to the nation. Now, Tame will argue that the tribe's gift to the nation was actually 1.2 million acres, less the lands that have since been returned. So, but within the settlement itself, within the legislation itself, the tribe received the 90,000 acres, and then it gave the conservation estate back to the Crown, which was half of the 90,000 acres. There was also a mechanism for the tribe to have a first right of refusal on lands that became surplus from 1995 onwards. So that was the first principle, the land for land principle. The second was seen as a compensation principle, and that arose from the 1946 establishment of the Tainui Trust Board, and that part of the compensation is encompassed in the following: ko te moni heotu mo te hara. When the Trust Board was established, the Crown offered £5,000 back then in perpetuity. And there was a lot of conflict within the tribe at the time to actually accept that offer. But Princess Te Puia was able to encourage the tribe and convince the politicians that we would accept it. So this principle is really about the money being payment for the sin. Some within the tribe saw it as blood money, so they didn't want to have anything to do with it. But Te Puia's strength of character was able to win the day, and so the Tainui Māori Trust Board was established. And as Tame has said, it wasn't full and final, it was a settlement for that time. Tainui Trust Board also gave the tribe a platform from which to launch further efforts to seek justice for the return of the lands, all the lands that had been confiscated, and actually set the platform for the 1995 settlement. So it included the lands, the river, which came much later, 2010. The harbours are still to be negotiated, and a relativity clause, which Shane will talk to more shortly. as a result of the settlement, a number of post-settlement entities have been created. The main one is Te Kawanganui Incorporated, which is the tribal parliament and consists of 3 members elected by each of the 68 marae, and they meet every 2 months, and they provide governance and oversight for the tribe. Kawanganui has an executive committee called Te Ara Tauda, and Te Ara Tauda manage and provide governance and oversight to the other companies and entities that the tribe has established, which include the Waikato Raupatu Lands Trust, the River Trust. We have representation on the Waikato River Authority and in the River Cleanup Trust. We're also the sole shareholder of Tainui Group Holdings, and the related entity that was established, the Waikato Tainui College for Research and Development. So the organisation that has been formed, this is one of the key objectives for the organisation. Kia tipu, kia hua, kia pōwai. To grow, prosper, sustain. So therefore, the organisation tried to achieve these things. Produce annual dividends for marae, for education and for training opportunities. Tainui Group Holdings manages all the commercial assets of the tribe. The tribe itself and its organisations and entities have input into policy development at both the national and local level. We monitor other settlements and try to make sure that we maintain, foster our relationships with other iwi and with the broader public. And by keeping in mind what our key objective is, it gives us a sense of who we are and where we're going, a type of compass to keep us moving forward as a tribe. These are some of my reflections, and some of these also Shane's, about the journey that we have been on and how we sort of see the world from our own personal perspectives and experiences. So one of the first things was that if it doesn't challenge you, it can't change you. And really, this settlement has changed the tribal world for ourselves and for iwi throughout the country. Another reflection was that if it doesn't kill you, it'll make you stronger. And some of those who've worked on this claim, both during our time and before, they've paid the ultimate price. And probably our third reflection was the principle of progressive resistance. So what is that? Well, we found that the more we worked and the harder we worked, the stronger we got. And this sort of reminds me of one of Te Puia's sayings, mahi te mahi. Hei painga mo te iwi. If it's good for the iwi, do it. This type of work certainly challenged us physically, mentally, spiritually, and in some cases relationships did suffer. And at times so did performance. It really stretched us. It forced us to overcome many adversities if we were to carry on in this type of work. And it tested our perseverance, our character, our commitment to the cause, It certainly pushed us way out of our comfort zones. But if we were to succeed, you certainly had to rise above it. You had to ride the wave or get crushed by it. I guess some of the good things that came out of this time for us was that it really toughened you up mentally. And mental toughness was a key characteristic. If you didn't have it at the beginning, you certainly would have had it by the end to have survived it. And I guess we had a clear vision, I guess, at the beginning of this, of what success would look like. Well, there was certainly enough examples from history and from our own tribal sayings and tongi and whakatauki to guide us in what we were trying to do. So for me, it meant, well, victory begins up here, begins in the mind. It made us face fear. It's the fight or flight response. And you're forced to overcome any doubts and insecurities you had. It made you dig deep for your courage, because this type of mahi tests everything. It tested our limits. We had to discover our potential, our full potential, and what that meant, and discover what that would take if we were to survive it. And it certainly focused our attention, because mahi like this makes you concentrate your energy and your resources that you have. You had to have self-confidence, because really you don't get far without it, with this type of mahi. You have to believe in yourself. And it expanded our perspective of the world. It expands your worldview, and then you see how it changes everything that you do and that you see. To get through, we had to execute very well. And really, the better you can execute, the better you perform, and the bigger the challenge you're able to handle. It also took a bit of stubbornness. Okay. You had to build up that unconquerable spirit within yourself. There's some of my reflections on the journey over the past 20 years. I haven't been with the organisation for all that time, maybe half that time, 10 years. But recently I came back into the organisation, where I'm now at the college with Sarah Jane and other staff that are here today. I wanted to end on a quote that Sir Robert often liked to use, and it was, "Some people see the world as it is and wonder why. Others see the world as it could be and ask why not," which is a quote from George Bernard Shaw. Nō reira, kia ora tātou.
Nā mihi nui tēnā koutou katoa, Leonie, Sarah Jane, tēnā kōrua. I'd like to firstly acknowledge the apology and reinforce the apology from the Ngāia Mahuta in Kōrua Wetare. They did try really hard to get here, but circumstances prevailed. So you get the B team. And as you can tell, we're just winging it at the moment. I just want to take the opportunity also to present the context of this 20 years, and the years leading to the 20 years. Because you can read about the detail, you can read the mechanics, but this is an opportunity for you to understand some of the context and some of the background and some of the humanness behind these negotiations. So that's the perspective I would like to present today. If I was to sum up in one word my reflection of the past 20 plus years, I would quote a line from one of my favourite novels by Charles Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities. And it opens with, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." And it almost was a French Revolution. I'd also like to open with some acknowledgements for the university and its role in the settlement process. If it hadn't been for the Centre for Māori Studies and the understanding of the university to allow the centre, under the directorship of Sir Robert Mahuta, to actually do the research into these negotiations, we would not be where we are today. The second point is also to acknowledge your Chancellor, James Bolger, who signed the deed of settlement alongside Te Ariki Nui. And also to acknowledge the support that the Te Kotai Institute and the college work collaboratively together, seeking pathways post-settlement. So those are a few acknowledgements I would like to make from the outset. When I saw the video that you saw previously, that's the second time I've seen it. The first time I seen it, I was presenting to a different audience, and I hadn't seen it before, and they didn't tell me they were going to put it up. And so I had to pause before I spoke because I was a bit choked by it. But I do reflect on that day, and I remember that day quite vividly. And we gathered at the marae, and some of you here today will also remember that day. And there was a light mist falling, and it wasn't a sunny day. It was a white, misty, typical Waikato day in May. And then the birds started singing, and the people were gathered. And those are some of the things I remember about that day. And it wasn't just those present on the marae, but those that were before. And the birds were singing that chorus. And those are some of the things I remember. When we talk about negotiations and settlements, it's not about the law. It's not about justice. It's not about right or wrong. It's not about politics. It's about personalities. And what John presented was really what we achieved, what we got back through that settlement, but it was how personalities formed and shaped the outcome. Now, if we look back in the early 80s, the late 80s, there was no such thing as treaty settlements in this country, no idea of treaty jurisprudence. The Treaty of Waitangi was established in 1975, but it only could look from 1975 onwards. It couldn't look back to the treaty. So there was the newness around that era. Nothing had been forged like this before. So we were entering into totally alien space. And that wasn't just for Māori, but it was also for the Crown. And with the 1987, when the jurisdiction of the tribunal was allowed to be retrospectively applied back to 1840, back to the treaty, then we lodged our claim in the Waitangi Tribunal in 1987. And that was to the lands, the Waikato River, and the West Coast harbours. But still, there was no movement from the National Front in terms of government until they wanted to sell state-owned enterprises, and coal came up. And so in 1989, we lodged a claim in the courts and ended up in the Court of Appeal. And I remember signing, because I was a young solicitor back then, witnessing the affidavits of many of our people that were filed in the Court of Appeal on the Coal Corp case. So that was the time, that was the thinking, that was the movement back then. And there was always that faith that things would prevail for us. So we won in the Court of Appeal, and that was what got us into negotiations. Because the judge in the Court of Appeal said, Waikato and Crown, sit down and have a conversation about this, about your grievance. So that's how we ended up in negotiations. And Labour government were there at the time. Richard Prebble was in charge of the negotiations, offered us $10 million fall and final in 1989. Sir Robert Mahuta said to him across the negotiation table, I will still be here next week, but I'm not sure you will be. There was an election and Richard Prebble wasn't there next week. So again, it's all around those personalities and foresights of your own personality. So we entered that dialogue with national government, Sir Graham Latimer back then. And John was talking about the quantum of land that was available for settlement, e riro whenua atu me hoki whenua mai. And it was only Crown land we were seeking because it was the Crown that took the land. We weren't seeking private lands, nor could you legally anyway. But that's not the point. The point was that it wasn't just 90,000 acres that we entered those negotiations in 1990, 91. There was twice as much land back then. But personalities prevailed, and the Crown were getting rid, as fast as they could, of most of their Crown holdings. So by 1995, we had only half of what we started with at the beginning of negotiations. So that was good faith. That was recorded in the apology. So, kei te pai. So we didn't get all that we wanted, but it was the personalities again that prevailed, and the two strongest personalities, obviously, at the negotiations, and our strongest personality was Te Ariki Nui, of course, but it was Sir Robert and Sir Graham. And we went into those negotiations as adversaries. But we could say no to each other as much as we could, but we had to find a solution. So we had to work together. And in that climate, as I said, there was no template, there was no precedent, there was nothing to follow. We were making it up as we went along. But it wasn't until September 1994 that Sir Graham finally got the principle of land for land. So that's September 94, in December 94, we signed the Heads of Agreement. So it was only a couple of months before we signed the Heads of Agreement that the Crown actually clicked to the principle. It's not about the money, it's about land for land. And I do remember that, and this is my personal reflection, because there was a Ranfurly Shield game on that Saturday, and I had to miss the game, because Waikato was playing and we had to negotiate the settlement. But that was the turning point for these negotiations, was they finally got the principle of land for land. And it was the force of personalities that made that happen. It wasn't the politics, it wasn't the law. It was the engagement of those two men, those two rangatira, to understand each other and to see what they could do respectively with their own different camps. And of course, Doug Graham had to go back to his people and Bob had to go back to his people. Now, Bob went back to his people on the 21st of December with the Heads of Agreement, the preliminary offer. Big hui at Turangawaewae, some of you would have been there. And the decision was made, let's take a vote on whether we will accept the settlement at this hui a iwi. So a couple of hundred people plus there. Our detractors were there, and they were there for valid reasons. Their criticisms were just as valid as our desires. So we had that mix of people in that atmosphere. So we had the secret vote. And it was secret because the yes box was labelled and put in one corner, and the no box, or those against the settlement, was placed on the stage in front of everyone. So your vote was secret. Then we went to Hopopu that night, and again, personalities played their part. And that was the night that the Heads of Agreement was signed. And it was right up till about 10 o'clock at night that they were still talking about these issues, still refining the detail around what the offer was and what we would or would not accept. The Huia Iwi that day, earlier in the day, had said, yes, go ahead, whatever you want to, we have faith in you, Sir Robert, to conclude a settlement, whatever that looks like. So the people had that faith. So there was the outstanding issues around relativity. Relativity, what does relativity mean? That was a clause that we wanted to say that if we settle, and we were going to be the first tribe to settle, and there was all that fiscal envelope palaver going on at the same time, if we were the first to settle, then we wanted to be the largest settlement ever. That didn't mean to say that any other settlement could not be worth what they believed the settlement was worth. It just meant that we wanted to be the largest. As an example, Ngāi Tahu, a couple of days later, Sir Tipene goes, "Congratulations, Waikato, but our settlement's 3 times as much." And we went, go for it, Tipene, because we'll get topped up again. So we weren't saying your settlements aren't worth more than ours. We're just saying that ours is going to be largest. So again, the personalities went, Sir Robert and Doug Graham went for a walk around Hopu, 10 o'clock at night. I think they had a cigar each. I'm not sure whether they shared one or not, but I'm pretty sure they had one each on their own. They went for this walk and they agreed 3 things. Firstly, relativity would apply. Secondly, interest would be paid on the 170 million. And thirdly, that in return for those, we would agree full and final, but full and final in our heads was a fiction and was only a legal distraction for us. So that was what was achieved, and those 2 men came back to everyone and signed the deed of settlement that night, and then we went off to Taupiri Maunga, as you do. So I guess just trying to reflect on those 20 years, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. There were many mistakes made, many lessons learnt, but there was always that optimism going forward, and that still remains. We had settled the land claim, there was still the river claim to go, and again that happened in 2008. It started off with the national government, transferred to the Labour government, and then transferred back to the national government, and many ministers in between. But we maintain always that there was only one principal negotiator. And I think if I look at negotiations today and what's happening today, there is a lot of that template from 95 that's applied now, and it's become the standard. But the key for us in 95 was not only the land for land principle, but was also the apology, which meant more to us than the cash settlement, because the apology condoned, firstly, that the reasons why we were invaded wasn't because we were rebels, and it was publicly recognised that we were unfairly labelled rebels, and that the kingitanga was a valid institution for us and was not a sign of rebellion against Queen Victoria. So those are the major principles around that. So I think in my conclusion, and I would like to encourage that we do have a conversation whilst we got the time, but my conclusion is that negotiations really were around a lot of the mahi, a huge sacrifice, a personal sacrifice if we want to be honest about things, and that's inescapable if you want to commit to a settlement and the resolution of settlements. People ask me, I say to people sometimes, and I don't mean to be offensive, but if I had committed murder, my sentence would be less than the time I spent with the tribe. I'll already be on parole. And as I said, it's not so much, these forums are an opportunity for you to get the context, and often we read about something that becomes history, but whilst we're still here, we can make that history part of today. And I'm hoping that's the case. And when I finish my PhD, well, actually I have to start my PhD, but it's a work in progress. You can read all about it in that. So, nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa.
Tēnā koutou. I think perhaps just to ask of our panel a couple of questions. I think certainly in terms of the context of both the historical context, which perhaps for all of us provides some understanding as to how we were propelled as a tribe into negotiations. And what was achieved in 1995 was actually building on an earlier settlement, as Tami talked about, that was actually negotiated by Te Puia, Peter Hurinui Jones and others back in 1946. So the process of settlements has actually been much longer than what we call, I guess, the contemporary settlements from 1995 on. But the question I'd like to pose to our panel is actually this notion of full and final, and particularly for other iwi that are going through the process. As a tribe, we are now 20 years post-settlement of the land claim, but as you've all alluded to, we have the river claim, which was settled, but we still have a number of outstanding claims. And the public perception is that what is full and final if we are still going back to negotiate or to raise claims. So from your opinion and your experiences and reflections, how do you respond to this notion of full and final?
If I can answer, the full and final, as I said, came in as part of the package of settlements. That was the bottom line for the Crown. Our principle was iwigo whenua atu mihi whiwhiri mai. Theirs was full and final. They also wanted to be seen as to be acting justly and fairly and reasonably. So those were their conditions, their stakes in the ground around negotiations. Now, full and final, and both Sir Robert and Sir Doug Graham have said in separate forums post-settlement that they, Bob has said that, did say that one generation cannot bind another, nor can one parliament bind another parliament. So for him and for us, we always knew that full and final was a fiction. I recall Doug Graham also saying at a law conference in Wellington, also around full and final, was that, again, it was a legal fiction. The point really was that it was something that the Crown had to say to the New Zealand public. They had to sell it to the New Zealand public that these settlements, these Maoris aren't going to come back again, time and time again, and ask for more. And we weren't going to be the Oliver Twist to do another Charles Dickens. We weren't going to do another Oliver Twist and go, please serve some more. So that, crudely and simply put, was what the Crown's position was. Our position was nothing is full and final. We demonstrated that in 1946, 50 years previously with Te Puia settlement. We came back 50 years later. We're still doing it with the river claim, and we're still going to do it with the further outstanding claims. I think my only advice to any iwi that wants to negotiate is you need to know what your principles are and arm yourself with your values and don't compromise. And that's the only way you can actually go through your negotiation.
And once you've gone through the negotiation, reach settlement, it's then that the hard work really starts. And often it's in that first 10 years that, well, in our own experience, someone once characterized it as a period of time like squabbling parents and naughty children. It's a time of sort of unrest and conflict within the tribe as they try to come to terms with how to manage the settlement and how to allocate various streams of benefit. So I guess in terms of looking at how it can, or maybe how it should be and how it shouldn't be done, we're quite a good case study for that. I think people learn quite a lot from the things that went wrong. But we see it happening even with some of the recent settlements and even those within Tainui. I mean, my own iwi sort of Ngāti Hoa are now having to grapple with some of those issues, even though they were able to reach settlement for the Ngāti Hoa claim very quickly. there's always the speed wobbles. And so I guess, know your principles. I think if we look at what the leadership of the tribe has done in the past, they've always looked at the tongi and the sayings and the whakatauki of previous leaders and used that as a guide. Certainly with the Raupatu claim, that was the case, where they went right back to Kingi Tawhia, sort of his sayings, Te Puia's sayings, and some of the other Kingitanga leaders. So, when there is nothing else, that's what you rely on. You rely on your own culture, on your own traditions, on your own history, as a lighthouse, if you like, for what you should do. So, it'd be different for everyone.
I think just following on from your comment about, everybody has their own experience. You did talk about, and more, that the real work begins once the settlement is signed. You talked about, John, having a clear vision of what success would look like. Now that the tribe is 20 years on, has that, this is a question for all of you, in your opinion, was that vision, or has that vision been realised? And if so, can you give examples of what that looks like? And then a follow-up question, what's still, or perhaps the lost opportunities? Again, I guess I'm trying to tease out both the good, the bad, and perhaps the ugly as reflections for others to learn from.
I think many of the objectives of the settlement have been achieved. Those which we knew in 1995 would be very difficult or would require a longer period of time to achieve were then put into our standing claims for addressing later on, maybe by the next generation. So in a sense, the way the settlement was managed was to take those sorts of issues into account. Of course, one of the if we look at the four cornerstones of what the 1995 settlement was about, well, land was returned. Okay. For ko te moni hei utu mo te hara, well, that's being addressed through relativity. Education, of course, was a key cornerstone of the settlement. Well, that was the vision of the endowed college. What was the fourth one, Shane?
Yeah.
Well, the river.
The river.
The river. And so the river settlement has now been achieved, and there's now development opportunities there for the tribe to, and the rest of the community really, to become involved in improving the health and well-being of the river and thereby the people. So in that sense, we've done, I think, achieved the initial set of objectives that were envisioned for the settlement. There's still lots to be done. First of all, there were supposed to be two colleges, one here in Waikato and one in Tāmaki. So we get to start the one in Tāmaki.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, if you look at the preamble and the apology in the 95 Beetle settlement, it didn't just talk about the loss of land, but it also talked about the ongoing social consequences. So it wasn't just that. It happened in 1863 and it's over. There was a culmination of consequences right up to today. So that's the first part. So it wasn't just about land loss, it was our degradation in society, our economic deprivation as well. So that's ongoing. I think the second point really is that settlements aren't a silver bullet. They're not going to fix everything, and nor should they. They're an opportunity, but they're not the total solution. I think that one of the hard questions our tribal members are asking today is we're a $1.2 billion tribe. You know, we started with 170 million, $100 million in land and $50 million and $70 million in cash, but now we're a $1.2 billion tribe. Now the question people need to ask, our tribal members need to ask, and ourselves we need to ask is, how fat does the cow have to be? You know, and again, it's not about cash isn't going to be the resolution or the solution for everything, but what opportunities are there to make that social impact influence? How can we persuade social policy, for example? So that, I think, in my head is where the college comes in. It develops those sort of things. So it's a sustainable, long-term objective. We have, I don't think that, I think we have been successful. It's been hard. There's a lot to learn, but I don't think we've made, if the only time we make a mistake is if we repeat that mistake and we haven't learned from it. So I think that making mistakes is a good thing because it helps us to grow, and we made some big ones, and very public ones. And I guess my other point, I guess, in relation to that is that with settlements, there is scrutiny, more intense than anything else. And when we, in 1999, 2000, made a $40 million value loss in our investments, you know, and then if you look at the context, Air New Zealand made $1 billion loss in the Waikato Times for a day, got bailed out by the New Zealand government, Waikato Tainui in the paper for every single day for a $40 million loss. So those are some of the perspectives, I think. And it's not only a lesson for the tribes, but it's a lesson for this country.
Just the only part I'd like to add that's a little bit different is that the tribe had a settlement of X amount, and that's grown that to today. But there's also a part and an obligation by the Crown to not only look at the tribe in that context, but because of legislation, because of rules, there are a lot of us at ground zero level, whānau, that are trapped by some of those rules and regulations. And I'll give you a case study, an example. Today is 2015. In 1995, Queen Elizabeth came to New Zealand, and part of the settlement signed the Royal Assent, which is the apology, and Shane can probably correct me if I'm incorrect here, the apology. Now, it's like that boy with the bike. She said, sorry that my officer kept your bike, but I'm not giving it back. So I'll just put it into context like that. Sorry for taking your bike, but I agree with them to give you only the bike back. Now, when we look at the ground level in relation to land, today, I cannot go to my grandfather's house and section in Ōparo in Kawhia. I cannot go there, get off the road, onto the little driveway and drive up because of this brutal law or rule called landlocked land. So it is landlocked. Before I can go up to the house, I've got to go to this farmer here, knock on his door and ask permission, and he'll tell me when I can go, when I can think. So a lot of us, including the King, has lands that are under this rule called landlocked. We don't want a handout. We just want the rules to make it so we can go and create our social wealth and make it productive like every other farmer. Still there. Many politicians have come into Parliament, attempted it, and I know they've going through a review now with the Te Rere Whenua Act, but it's just one of the sad rules that we can make it happen. Just give us that access to there without making so many rules, so many regulations. There are so many of these rules embedded in council rules and other departments that keep your legs, those chains, on your feet.
I think another question or comment I'd like to ask from you is reflecting around, Shane, your comment that we as a tribe are now $1.2 billion in terms of our net worth or value. I'm not actually sure if it's net worth, but $1.2 billion is probably the public perception. In 1995, the tribe was, I think, around 35,000 in number, and we are now at around 70,000 in number. So in, I guess, thinking about how we plan for the future and if we are increasing our wealth, how then do we transfer the wealth? And I think the wealth in its broadest context, the media likes to focus on the 1.2, on the dollar value, but also I guess what is some learning for us even as a tribe that we don't focus solely on the bottom line being our financial statements, but what are our bottom lines for ourselves as a people moving forward? Knowing that we are a young tribe, how do we ensure or try and make up for that disruption, as you stated in 1863? How do we catch up, and how do we hold both ourselves as a tribe accountable, but also continue to hold the Crown accountable in order to move into that better state that we were in?
Good question. And again, and you're right, Sarah. Wealth isn't just about money. And Bob always said the wealth that Waikato needs is between our ears. So I think that's the first point to make, is that if we can invest in our own people and their own education, then we can invest in people that can go out and influence, and therefore influence government policy, government payment, budgets and that, government agencies, and not only just nationally but internationally. Then I think that's where our wealth needs to be focused. There are immediate needs, of course. In the tribe, I think there might have been 20,000 people at the time of settlement from the postal referendum that we sent out, and now we're $70,000. So for me, that is a huge sign of success, that people are now affiliating and coming on board with Waikato. And you need the politicians there to really give you a good answer to this. But my view again is, and I really firmly believe that full and final can never be full and final, because there's always needs of the generations coming that need to be met and resolved. And for me personally, I think it's important that we do leave some challenges for the generations to come, like we had challenges and like our ancestors had challenges, so that we do grow as a people and retain our uniqueness as a Waikato. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question. All I can say is that wealth should not just be measured solely in the annual report and what the bottom line is financially, but what we have made our contribution, and you'd know that we've made significant contributions to scholarships, millions of dollars. I don't know the exact number, I think it's about $15 million worth of scholarship contributions to people, to our young people. We've made a significant contribution to our marae in terms of marae grants and dividends. So those are the key fundamentals. I think with the Tribal Plan Whakatupuranga 2050, that's the blueprint and the plan going forward now, because every outcome has to have a strategy behind it and to support it. So it's really, the next stage for me, I guess, is really how the tribe starts implementing those aspirations in that plan.
I guess to use Tame's analogy, we've received the bell as part of our settlement. We still need the rest of the bike back. And while our economic growth or our financial wealth might be growing exponentially or skyrocketing away, there's a lag and a lack of people, health and well-being, keeping up with that, so there's a gap between, how well we're doing financially or economically and how well we're doing, like as a people. And so the challenge is how you link our well-being with our wealth, so that they at least on par with each other. So I don't know how you fix that. Maybe someone out there does.
But actually, I don't know if anyone does know. You know, these problems exist throughout the world. So we're just another example. So I guess maybe some research should be done on that and how we fix that. And maybe the college might be a good place to start.
Maybe
that
Sarah
type of money.
Jane and Leonie might have the answer.
Yeah, probably. I think in terms of settlement, we've come a long way, and there's a lot of positives that can be taken out of the settlement that has happened. Really, what we're talking about is trying to compress time. You can't do that. We've lost so much time in Raupatu, and we've only been walking on this journey for 20 years trying to grow that potential again or recapture what we were prior to settlement. So it's a time thing, and don't get frustrated that we're not. We are doing well in that short period, number one. Number two, I agree with John and Shane that we've got to grow the first 2 inches in your head, above the top of your head. That first 2 inches is growing that. The third point I want to say is real change in helping this country is getting our whānau into local government and into government and voting to where the power is. Like I heard our kaumātua say back in the day, when you get to the party, boy, the party's not at the gate, it's in the house. So if you want to come to our party, get into the house, not at the gate. So if you want to make change, get your people into, your scholars into local government and into government.
Ka pai. Oh, well. I think that was a fitting challenge for all of us, perhaps just to bring this session to an end. And possibly, I think, reflecting back for those of us knowing that the Kingitanga has as its motto, ko te mana motuhake, so perhaps, Tami, just a fitting way to end our session this afternoon. Sir Robert always talked about the fact that while we lost land, we never lost our mana. And I guess the challenge for us has been demonstrated this afternoon is that there are still challenges, but ultimately our mana is still intact. And I think there are still challenges for generations to come, but so long as we hold on to our mana and how we define that is really important. I think in seeing the video also and reflecting on two things, and it goes back to Tami's initial statements around the context to Raupatu, and he talked about this notion of a bird. And I reflect on that because the significance of the return of korotangi to the tribe, which was the Crown's gift, and perhaps it might be not quite appropriate to reference it in the context of the bike, but I'll go along with that, is that, you know, it wasn't so much around the fact that it would enable us as a mechanism to move forward korotangi in and of itself, but the symbolic nature of what korotangi represented. And my limited understanding of korotangi connected to our tribe, in that it was the guardian who helped navigate us across those uncharted waters from Hawaii, or charted, depending on those navigators. If Hotu was here, he'd probably correct me. But I guess that to try and build on that metaphor of the notion of a bird with korotangi there and also with Te Ariki Nui, Te Atai Rangi Kahu, and the challenges that she had faced in trying to provide some stable leadership during a very tumultuous period for the tribe. It was, as Shane mentioned, not a unanimous decision that the tribe made. Certainly for those of us who were there on the day can recall, and not long ago, Aubrey Te Kanawa gave some really beautiful accounts of his own grandmother sitting outside the gates of Turanga Waiwai, and understanding, again, the relationship that people had. It was not around the person or the personalities, but more around the context. And I think it was important for us as a tribe to acknowledge, as it still is, that yes, we are moving forward, but we still also move forward knowing that we aren't moving forward and leaving those mamae behind. They continue to come alongside us as reminders, I think, perhaps the checks and balances, or to use Tami's words, ngā wairua ture, perhaps to make sure that we continue to reflect on why we do things and how we are doing things. So I think to try and bring this together, that maybe it's been a good thing that we haven't had our two politicians with Koro and Nanaia here this afternoon. We've had a much more intimate opportunity to explore the settlement from those who were involved in the negotiations, who saw it from the hard graft, who did have to suffer in terms of being the face of a very unpopular decision at the time, and having to take it not just from our own people, but also from those who did not understand, so the federated farmers, the general public, having to address the media constantly, as well as our own people. So the lessons, I guess, for me from listening to them this afternoon was being strong in who we are as a people, being resolute in our values, being uncompromising in those, making sure that we are always going back to the past, that our past does come with us, but having that clear direction set for us, what are we trying to achieve. Personally, I know I am, and I'm sitting in a room of many of us who have benefited directly from the settlement of Raupatu. The investment in higher education, I am a product of that, and I'm very proud and humbled to say that. And I know that there are many of us here at the University of Waikato as alumni, as we are across not just Aotearoa, but across the world, who have benefited from the sacrifices of successive generations to enable us to stand tall, me tū whakaiti, but always I think the memories of those people who've passed on in the video, that is our responsibility to ensure that their sacrifices, what they paid the ultimate price for, we are benefiting from. So what is our legacy for the future generations? What is it that we will leave our future generations, not just in terms of the challenges, but also in terms of the fruits? So it has been a real privilege and an honour to share the stage with these three amazing men. As I think Shane might not like it to talk about wisdom. He'd probably say I'm still too young to be called somebody of wisdom, but to share thoughts and reflections.
King Solomon.
My Dickens knowledge is a little bit, I think you've exhausted it already, but to have this wonderful opportunity this afternoon, to thank the Te Kotahi Research Institute, Leone, for providing this, especially here on Kingitanga Day. We are in our 20th year reflecting on the lessons of Raupatu, and more importantly, I think, from this afternoon, hopefully some wisdom as to what the next 20 years or the next 20 generations, what they might be doing in that time to reflect back on the achievements that these three men have contributed to. So please join me in thanking our panel this afternoon.